want to welcome you to our annual Hays High Financial Night. I wanted to point out a couple things. I think most of you probably got the PowerPoint handouts, but if you did not, they are at the back. We also will be posting this on our school counseling site under HaysHighIndians.com. And there's also some scratch paper and pencils in case you need more to write on. But I am going to go ahead and introduce Wendy Rohleder-Suk. She is the Director of Financial Assistance from Fort Hays State University. And we really, really appreciate her coming out and visiting with all of us and helping us learn a little bit more about financial aid. So let's give her a warm welcome, and I'll let her talk.
Good evening. Can you hear me okay? Is the mic carrying? Okay. Okay. We might turn up just a little bit. Good evening. As Will said, my name is Wendy Rohleder-Suk. I'm the Director of Financial Aid or Financial Assistance Office at Fort Hays State University. I'm here tonight, though, as a member of CASFA, which is the Kansas Association of Student Financial Aid Administrators. And we are a group of financial aid administrators from around the state in the profession. And we do this as service to the profession. So I'm not here specifically to talk about Fort Hays. I'm here to provide some general information that should be applicable wherever you go to school. And there will be things that I will reference or indicate that you should go and ask questions of the financial aid office at the school where you or your student is planning to attend. How many students do I have in the room tonight? Great, great. Love to see students here. I commend you for being here, taking a direct involvement in this process. I think that's incredibly important. For those of you parents whose children could not be here with us tonight, please share this information with them. And I would strongly encourage you to involve them in this process. It is one that they will go through every year. And I think it's incredibly important that they take some ownership of it from the beginning. So please, as you're completing the FAFSA, sit down with them and have them involved in that process. They will start to get information from the schools that they're applying to, and it's important that they recognize what sort of information they're getting, maybe action that needs to be taken so that they can move through the process successfully. So this is a little bit unusual for us doing this in September. Usually we do this session in early December when it's much colder outside and it's dark by the time that we start this. So this is very unusual. And the reason for that is that there have been a couple major changes to the FAFSA for the 2017-18 academic year. And the first one being that the FAFSA is available earlier than it has ever been before. I'm going to talk some more specifics about that when we get to that part, but October 1st is the date that the FAFSA will be available this year. So that's exciting, I think, for students and their families. It's exciting for us as financial aid administrators, and we'll be really excited to see how the year goes with that new change and process. And again, we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go. So what I'm going to talk about tonight are several different topics, and I'll just kind of breeze through this list, and of course we'll go in detail with each one of these. We're going to talk about what financial aid is, what a cost of attendance is, or sometimes that's referred to as a budget, what the expected family contribution, and you may hear schools or others say EFC. What that means is that's the expected family contribution. We're going to talk about what it means to have financial need, the different types, categories, and sources of financial aid, the FAFSA, the free application for federal student aid, and then some special circumstances that we may encounter. Okay, so what is financial aid? When we say financial aid, we define that very broadly. So we define that as any finances or any funds, whether it be scholarships, grants, loans, work study, that are provided to students to assist with paying for post-secondary educational expenses. So that's a very broad definition. Sometimes we hear students say, I'm not eligible for financial aid, and sometimes they're just referring to things like grants. We refer to financial aid, like I said, very broadly, that includes all of those different types. And that being said, if a student is eligible for federal financial aid, they are eligible for some type of aid. It may not be every type that you see listed here, but there are funds available in some source. So what is the cost of attendance? The first thing that we look at when we are awarding financial aid is what the student's cost of attendance is. So this includes a number of different items. Tuition and fees, room and board, and books and supplies are ones I think that are very familiar to people, the obvious ones when you think about costs to go to college. But we also allow funds for transportation as well as personal expenses. So this really varies kind of by student. We come up with our best estimate of what it's going to cost for a student to attend college for an academic year, but we also know that sometimes those expenses will differ for students depending on their particular situation. For example, for transportation expenses, if your student is going to school locally, then they may not have as much in transportation cost as if they would if they were going to a school that was farther away and required them to drive back and forth or to fly back and forth from the school home. So those are things as you're sitting down and kind of figuring out what your individual cost is to take into consideration. You know, you can look at what the school provides as their estimate, but then sit down and kind of work through all of those pieces for you as the student or for your student as parents. Same thing with personal expenses. That depends on what sort of items you have expenses for. So, and what sort of items or different types of things that you want to pay for. The other thing to look at is whether they are direct or indirect costs. Many schools will have what they consider direct costs, which would include tuition and fees, room and board if the student is living on campus, and those are billed directly to the student. When financial aid comes in, those are university charges that are paid with that financial aid. But then there are those indirect costs that would be perhaps books and supplies that a student has to go maybe to a bookstore or they go online to purchase those books and supplies. And again, that amount's going to vary depending on the student, or those other types of expenses like personal expenses and transportation. Cost of attendance will vary from school to school. So your cost of attendance will be different at Fort Hays versus another school that you attend. And I think it's a really good idea to compare those as you are figuring out where you want to go to school. Compare those so you're comparing apples to apples. You know, what's the tuition at this school versus the tuition at this school? What's room and board costs? What's room and board costs? To really figure out what the financial situation will be at school A compared to school B. So the expected family contribution. This is an amount that the federal government has determined a family can reasonably be expected to contribute to a student's financial costs for school. This will, for a student who is starting as a first-time freshman, this will include contributions from the student if they have some income. We know many of our students work part-time jobs while they're in high school, so they may have some income, as well as the parents' income. Both of those are going to count for that EFC. What happens when students fill out the FAFSA is they include all that information. There then is a formula that is applied to determine what the EFC is based on that student and parents' income, as well as tax information. They're also looking at how many how many people may be in the household, how many may be in college. So there are a number of factors that they look at in determining that EFC. It's also important to know that there are several allowances that are put into place, what they're called income protection allowances, so that if a family makes $50,000, for instance, the student's EFC is not going to be $50,000. It's going to be something much less than that, because the federal government in their formula will determine that, okay, we understand the income may be $50,000, but we also know that there may be a mortgage, rent to pay, food, and all those other expenses that that family needs to survive. So it is truly what can be reasonably expected to help cover the educational costs for this student. The EFC will be the same regardless of where the student goes to school. So whether it's school A or school B, that EFC is going to remain the same. So what is financial need? So we're looking at the cost of attendance, or the budget, the estimate of what we think it's going to cost for the student to attend for the academic year. subtract the EFC, the expected family contribution, and that will determine financial need. So if that number is a plus number, then the student has financial need and may be eligible for certain types of aid. And I will go through the different types of aid here in a minute to give you an idea of which ones are need-based and which ones are not need-based. So as I indicated before, the cost of attendance is going to vary, and I think this graph does a nice job of explaining that. Cost of attendance varies. The EFC stays the same regardless of the school, so your need will vary. The cost of attendance then is going to make the difference as to how much need a student has. So it is very possible that a student may have need at school A, but may not have need at school B, depending on that cost of attendance. Any questions so far? I did forget to mention at the beginning that if there are questions that are general in nature, I'm happy to take those either kind of as we're talking about something or at the end of the presentation. If you have questions that are much more specific to you or your student, I will be available and Robin will be available to field those questions individually one-on-one after the session. So let's move on to different types of aid. So we break this into two different categories: gift aid, or free money, the best kind, and then self-help aid. So your gift aid would be things like scholarships and usually grants. That's aid that does not have to be repaid by the student. Self-help aid would be considered things like loans or employment. So things that either you have to pay back or you have to work and earn to get. Okay, so the sources of financial aid, we talk a lot about the federal government filling out the FAFSA, and we'll go into great detail there. But there are other sources as well of financial aid that I would encourage you all to look at. One is state aid. The state of Kansas does have aid available to students in scholarship programs and in grant programs. So I'd encourage you to take a look there at the Kansas Board of Regents website. Colleges and universities have aid that they distribute institutionally to students. Private sources could be an outside organization that maybe provides scholarships, for instance. A lot of times we see students bring in outside scholarships from community organizations, civic organizations, churches and the like that are offering a scholarship. And then employers sometimes may have a scholarship or assistance for the student as an employee, or perhaps for the parent who has a student going to college. So please, we encourage you to take a look at all possibilities out there. So what is out there for students? So we start with the Pell Grant. Pell Grant is probably the most famous or maybe common federal aid program available to students. It is need-based, and it is based strictly on a student's expected family contribution. It happens automatically. So if a student submits their FAFSA, they have an EFC in the correct range, they will be awarded a Pell Grant. Yeah?
So student, since it's partly student, partly parent, I don't know how to ask this without it sounding rude. So it sounds, sometimes you feel like if your student earns a lot of money, it's penalized. I'm not saying that, I don't
Yeah.
say that really, but is that true?
It could be. It could be in the sense that if they earn a fair amount from working, that amount is going to count in that formula to determine their estimated family contribution.
To what they make, right?
Say that again?
Because they have to put what they make
Yes.
from the year before.
Yes.
whatever.
Yes, that's correct. The range for Pell Grants ranged anywhere for this current year for 16-17 from $291 to $58.15, and those are awards for the academic year. The Pell Grant will be based on need and what that EFC is. It's kind of a graduated scale. It will also be dependent upon the enrollment level for the student. So whether they are a full-time student or they're a part-time student, that award will vary. The Federal Supplemental Educational Opportunity Grant, the FSEOG grant, is a supplemental grant that is designed for the neediest of students. It is, as it says on the slide there, based on availability. And what that means is it is a limited funded program. As universities, we get a certain allotment of FSEOG funds. We award those to students based on a first come, first served basis. And we only have a limited amount of funds to award. So when schools tell you that it's important to submit the FAFSA early, this is one of the reasons, because there are some limited funded programs that they will start awarding, and you increase the chances of being awarded that, if you're eligible, if you submit your FAFSA early as opposed to later in time. The TEACH grant is a grant that is designated for students who are planning to teach in high-need fields in high-need geographic regions. It is a grant that requires service after the student has completed their degree, and they do sign an agreement to serve to do that. If they do not meet their obligation to teach in that high-need field in a high-need geographic region, that grant all of a sudden becomes an unsubsidized loan. And I'll talk a little bit more what kind of loan that is. So we really counsel students to be really sure that that is the field that they're planning to be in, and they've really done some really good career counseling before doing that, because if they don't meet that obligation, it turns into a loan, and interest will accrue from the date that it was dispersed to them while they were in college. So very important that they make that decision very carefully. The Kansas Comprehensive Grant is one of those state grants that I was talking about, as determined by the Kansas legislature. In terms of funding, it is limited funded, available at four-year colleges and universities in the state, again, based on availability, because it is a limited funded program. Oh, sorry. Somebody should have hollered at me. Sorry. But you're following along on your handout, right? Okay, so holler at me next time when I forget to advance my slide. Okay, here we go. So, Federal Work Study. Federal Work Study is a program that also is limited funded and also is need-based. And this program allows us to award work study funds to a student. And what this means basically is the student has an opportunity. They have to apply for a job and be hired in the job. But part of those funds that they receive will be paid for by this work study federal program. Now, the advantage to the student is that many times departments on campus may not have their own departmental budget funds that allow them to hire students. But if they have a work study student, they don't have to come up with that money in their budget. So sometimes departments can hire work study students that otherwise they could not hire in departmental funds. So if a student has work study, they may have some advantages in being able to apply for some jobs that are restricted to work study students. Now, this does not mean that students cannot work on campus if they don't have work study. That's not true. Most all universities have departmental positions available to students as well. I would encourage you as students, and those parents encourage your students to search for those opportunities on whatever campus they go to, because I think that working on campus is incredibly important for students. I think if they're looking for a part-time job, working on campus affords them some benefits that maybe working off campus does not. And primarily that being that they are on campus and those departments treat them as students first. So that there are important things that they need to do because they are a student. Departments do everything they can to work around those student schedules. So they come up with come at it with a very student-first attitude. It's also very convenient for students. You know, if they can pop into an office and work for 3 hours between classes, that's usually pretty convenient for them, as opposed to leaving campus and going to their off-campus employer. So I would encourage all students to look for that opportunity. Federal Work Study's limited funded program. So submitting the FAFSA early puts students maybe in the best position. But I would also encourage your students, you as students, to look at being on a wait list. If you aren't awarded, perhaps in the first round, maybe you know that you have need, but you weren't awarded Federal Work Study when you first got your award letter, contact their office and see if they have a wait list, because sometimes students don't take their work study awards, so work study awards may become available at a later time. So I'd encourage you to take a look at the financial aid office or the student employment office about opportunities to be put on a wait list for work study. So federal direct loans is kind of one of the last categories of student aid, and Federal direct loans can be in two different forms. They can be either a subsidized loan or an unsubsidized loan. And the subsidized loan is the better loan of these two options, and that is because the federal government handles and pays for the interest while the student's enrolled at least half time. Subsidized loans are need-based, so a student has to have need in order to be eligible for a subsidized loan. An unsubsidized loan is also a loan in the student's name, but interest will accrue on that loan while the student's enrolled. The student does not have to pay that interest while they're in school, but it will be accruing while they're enrolled. Now, there are some limits here. The freshman loan limit, the total annual loan limit is $5,500. So the most in loans, subsidized and unsubsidized, that a student can receive in a given year is $5,500 as freshmen. That amount, $3,500, a maximum of $3,500 can be in a subsidized loan. The remaining $2,000 would be in an unsubsidized loan. That amount will change as the student goes through their different grade levels. So as a sophomore, that $5,500 increases to $6,500. And then as a junior and senior, that amount increases to $7,500. And each year, that subsidized loan eligibility also increases by $1,000. So as a sophomore, they can have $4,500 maximum in subsidized loans, and as seniors can have juniors and seniors can have $5,500 maximum in subsidized loan funds. The interest rate on those loans for 16-17 was 3.76%. That is a fixed interest rate for loans from that year. Now, those rates will change every year. So for 17-18, we'll see a different rate, but it will stay fixed on the loans for that particular year. So the next type of loan is a federal direct loan for parents. It's called a Parent Plus loan. And this loan is designed for parents to borrow on behalf of their student to help for the educational expenses for their student. This is a loan that interest will accrue on as the student is enrolled, so it's not a subsidized loan. There is a process by which parents must submit a request as well as a master promissory note. It is a credit-based loan, so they do a credit check and you have to be approved in order to qualify for the Federal Plus loan. But essentially, you can borrow, if approved, up to the student's cost of attendance. So when we start and we take that cost of attendance first, we then, maybe the student has some scholarships, maybe they have some grants, and then we've awarded the student's loan eligibility. If we aren't yet to that cost of attendance or that budget amount, whatever the gap is can be taken out in a Parent Plus loan if the parent chooses to do so. And then lastly, private or alternative loans. We encourage parents and students to look at all options for financial aid. And that is one option beyond what the student's eligible for that parents or students might want to look at and do some good comparisons between the Plus loan and what private or alternative loan options might be out there. Most of the time, alternative loans or private loans would be in a student's name. Most of the time, as dependent students, they are not eligible on their own to qualify for a private or alternative loan, so they may need a cosigner. There are some companies, though, that recently now have started parent private or alternative loans that's in the parent, or it could even be in a different third party loan to take out on behalf of the student and their educational expenses. Any questions about types of aid or anything? Yeah.
Does the work study depend, is work study usually need-based?
Yes. Yes, it is. Any other? Okay, so now that you know what the types are, what's out there and available, how do you get it? So filling out the FAFSA, the free application for federal student aid. How many of you have filled out a FAFSA before? Okay, so we have some who this is not brand new to. The FAFSA is available at fafsa.gov. And we always start with this point because there are some private companies out there that sometimes solicit parents and students to submit the FAFSA through them. FAFSA.com has been one in the past. And you pay a fee to this company. They then turn around and go to this website and submit it for free with your information. Now, it's a legitimate business, but I want you all to know that you can submit the FAFSA for free without paying anyone to do it. And financial aid offices at the school where you're going or your student is going will be happy to help you through that process and answer any questions that you might have about it. So go to FAFSA.gov. The other important thing to note, let me see, is to make sure that you have the correct award year. So when you're going in to submit the FAFSA, which you can do in just like 2 short weeks, October 1st, 2016, make sure that you are selecting the 2017-18 academic year. Because if you submit the 2016-17 academic year, you're going to be applying for aid for the current year, for students who are in college right now. So you want the 17-18 academic year. Yeah. Mm-hmm. No, because typically you are not eligible for federal aid for concurrent credit. Good question. So yeah, you'll be looking at 17-18. We've had a lot of students and parents accidentally submit the wrong one, and then they can't figure out why it's not working or why we don't have them in the right year, and it's because the wrong one was submitted, which only means that you'll have to go in and submit it again in 17-18. So make sure that you have the right year on there that you want. We expect that this may be even more confusing now that the FAFSA is available earlier than it has been in the past. So be careful about that. As I indicated before, information that you provide on the FAFSA is going to calculate your expected family contribution. It's important to note that schools usually have a FAFSA priority deadline. For instance, Fort Hays is March 1st. I would encourage you to contact the schools that you're planning to apply to and make sure that you're aware of when their priority deadline is. Those things may be changing. I think with the advent of early FAFSA, which is what they're calling the new changes, that some schools may change those priority deadlines. So even if you've had parents, if you had a child who's gone before and it's always been this date, make sure that you double check those this year so that you have the correct date. But even that being said, with priority deadlines, I would still encourage you to submit the FAFSA as early as you can. And I would encourage you to do that as early as October 1st, if you are able to do so. There is a paper application that's available, but I would strongly advise against using a paper application. I think that submitting it online, one, is so much easier. Getting through the whole process is much easier if you can do it online, and most students do that today. So I want to make sure that I'm covering. Okay, so one of the other changes for the FAFSA this year, besides the early time that it's available, is that you will be using older income and tax information. So in the past, students and parents used the previous year's tax information. That is now changing to the, I guess what I'll call the previous tax year. So for 17-18, that will be the 2015 tax information rather than the 2016 tax information, which is what it has been in the past. So when the FAFSA is open on October 1st, you should be able to go in, enter information. Hopefully you have your taxes filed. There may be some exceptions for those who have extensions, but that should be wrapped up pretty quickly as well. You should be able to go in and use that tax and income information and be ready to go. So we're excited, and I think that parents and students will be too, that there's no longer this need to wait to have taxes filed and have all the information that they need before submitting the FAFSA. So I think students and parents should be able to go in right away, have all the information they need to go and submit that early to schools. So the student demographic information that will be required to submit is, of course, the student's legal name. So that's important. They do some checks with Social Security Administration, so you want to make sure that that information is accurate, as well as the Social Security number. And this is an area that I'll highlight in a minute that has most common mistakes on the FAFSA is Social Security number, that they transpose digits or they're one number off or whatnot. So please make sure that all Social Security numbers are entered accurately. We'll ask for gender on there, and the purpose of that is for selective service requirements. If a student is born male and has not registered for the selective service, there'll be a question there about that, and they'll be required to do that in order to be eligible for federal aid. They will ask for citizenship, and this will be, in order to qualify for federal aid, students must be U.S. citizens or must be eligible non-citizens. As U.S. citizens, they will have a Social Security number tied to their legal name. And then as eligible non-citizens, they would have both an alien registration number as well as a Social Security number that will need to be entered. When we get to grade level, it's important that I think every student in this room will be starting as a freshman. May be a change to that as a sophomore. Sorry, thank you. You might have to click for me anyway. So students will need to indicate their grade level, like I said, probably as freshmen. It's possible they could be a sophomore if they have enough credits, but most of the time they would be a freshman. It's important here to note that they are not graduate students and they're not seniors. They're asking for their grade level starting in college, not for their current level as a high school senior and not as a graduate. So they also will usually be pursuing a bachelor's degree or could be an associate's degree. They will need those before they would go on to do a master's degree or a PhD. So be careful about those areas. And then foster care, if a student has been in foster care, there's a place that they can indicate that and it will provide some additional resources for that student. And we, of course, would be happy to talk with students and explain that a little bit further if there are students in those situations where we can hopefully direct them to some really great resources. So students will also be able to put on up to 10 schools that they're interested in. We know at this point, especially now that we're much earlier, that students may be looking at a lot of different schools and trying to figure out where they want to go. So I encourage students to put on all the schools that they're interested in. They can do that up to 10. And what will happen is that all of those schools will receive their FAFSA information. So I do think it's important to be, not just put 10 schools because you have room to put 10 schools, because you're then going to have 10 schools who are contacting you, maybe asking for additional information and additional follow-up. So make sure they're schools that you're legitimately interested in attending. But you can go back and add things. So if at the point that you submit the FAFSA, you're interested in these 5, but you've decided, oh, I'm really not interested in this one anymore, you can go in and take that school off. And on the reverse, if there's another school that's come into play, you can go and add that school onto your FAFSA. They will also ask housing questions. That helps us determine what the cost of attendance will be for a student, because room and board will be different for a student who is living on campus as compared to a student who's living at home. So their options are at home with parents, on campus, or off campus. Students can change their mind, so if that changes, they can go in and make an adjustment if they were planning to be, let's say, at home with parents and then decided instead they're going to live on campus, so that they can make that change. Okay, so the next questions, or series of questions that students will have, helps determine whether they are a dependent student or they are an independent student. And there are several factors there, and basically, if the answer to any of those questions is yes, the student is an independent student. And what that means is that the student will provide only their income and tax information and not the parents' tax and income information. If they answer no to all of those questions, they are considered a dependent student, and they must provide not only their information but their parents' information as well. A common question that we get about this is, well, I don't claim my student on my taxes, so can't they be independent? Unfortunately, no. For the purposes of the FAFSA, the federal government has defined very clear guidelines that are not in line or exact as the IRS guidelines for dependency status. And if they do not meet any of these criteria, they are dependent students. And the federal government says you are dependent students, then we expect your family, your parents, to provide assistance to help you pay for college expenses. So parent information on the FAFSA. So we commonly get questions about what parent should I put on my FAFSA? Maybe I have a situation where my parents are divorced or not married, and how do I decide who to put on the FAFSA and which parent? First rule is that if the parents are living together, regardless of whether they're married or not, they need to include both parents' financial information on the FAFSA. If parents are divorced or separated, then the student should include the parent who they lived with more during the past 12 months. That's the parent information that needs to go on the FAFSA. If that parent is remarried, they also need to include that step parent's information on the FAFSA. A note there at the bottom, grandparents, foster parents, and legal guardians are not considered parents unless they have legally adopted the student. And if there are specific questions about that, that certainly is an area that Robin and I will be happy to answer and talk more through with anybody with specific questions there. So what information do you need to have to complete the FAFSA? You need tax information, income information, benefits. You do not need 401k or IRA balances. Those are not calculated into the EFC. You do not need the value of your primary residence, where you live. You do not need to include the value of that residence. And then you would need any other untaxed income, such as child support received. That also needs to be included on the FAFSA. So one of the handy tools that they started about 5 or so years ago is the IRS data retrieval tool. And this makes things very easy for parents and students, as well as for financial aid administrators, if you are eligible and will use the IRS data retrieval tool. And what happens is when you're submitting the FAFSA and you get to that income and tax information, it gives you an option to basically transfer over to the IRS website, see what your tax information is there, transfer it back to the FAFSA, and then submit your FAFSA with that information. So keys to doing that, if you use that option, and we strongly recommend using it, don't change the information after you transfer it back to the FAFSA, because it essentially kind of invalidates it for purposes of verification. And I'm not going to go into a lot of specifics on verification, other than to say, if you are selected for the verification process, you will have to provide some additional information to the financial aid office so that they can verify that the information on the FAFSA is correct. If you use the data retrieval tool, one, you may lessen the chance of being selected for verification, and two, if you are selected for verification, you already have one of the components already taken care of by using that IRS data retrieval tool. So please, please use it. However, it's possible you may not be eligible to use it if you have filed an amended return, if you don't have a social security number, or you are married but filing taxes separately. So there are a few categories where it's not available, but if it is available, it will give you that option, and you'll be able to transfer over to the IRS and transfer it back. Yeah? Absolutely. Great question. The question was, if your student filed taxes, can they also use that option? Yes, assuming they're eligible, and most of the time students are eligible, and I would strongly encourage them to do it for the same purposes. Great question. Okay, so I mentioned before frequent FAFSA errors, social security numbers, number one. Occasionally there are errors with regard to divorce or remarried parents, and I talked a little bit about that as far as who to include on the FAFSA. income earned by parents or step-parents, also related, untaxed income, taxes paid, household size, number in college, real estate and investment worth, and what assets to include. And I'm not going to go into great detail on each of these, but what I would strongly recommend is as you're going through the FAFSA, there are a lot of really good help boxes along the way that will give you some really good instructions and clarification about what these questions mean. What needs to be included, what does not need to be included. So read through those help boxes really carefully, and it may very well answer the question that you have. If you're not sure, do I include this, do I not include this, check to see what the guidance is, because they do a pretty good job of answering most all questions related to what does need to be included. We're also happy to field those questions, as I think any financial aid office for the schools that your student is looking at, to help clarify that for you if you have questions. And again, afterwards, Rob and I, if you have some things you know up front you have questions about, we'll do our best to try to field those for you tonight. Students can always go back and make corrections to their FAFSA by logging back into the FAFSA, making the correction, and then resubmitting it to the federal processor. So that's the key. Sometimes we have students who don't use the data retrieval tool, let's say, initially, but then they're selected for verification, so they want to go back and use it. And they can, we encourage that, but they would need to go in, make that link over, transfer the data back onto the FAFSA, and then resubmit the FAFSA. So it's always key to make sure to resubmit so that the financial aid offices get that information back in their office. So one of the handouts that you picked up today on the gold sheet talks about the FSA ID. And some of you who have had students previously and filled out the FAFSA, you may remember something called a PIN, the FAFSA PIN. The PIN no longer is good, but you can transition it to your FSA ID. The FSA ID will replace that PIN. It basically, helps you create a username and a login in order to access the FAFSA. Both the parent will need one and the student will need one. It's much more secure than the PIN was. It used to be that you would have to put in a social security number, a name, and a PIN number to get into the FAFSA, and you no longer have to do that. You log in with the FSA ID. The most important information on this slide is at the very bottom, which says that each FSA ID requires a different email address. We've seen some problems with the FSA ID for parents who were trying to be very helpful to their student, and they went and they created their FSA ID, and then they went and created their student's FSA ID using the same email address. You can't do that. It has to be different email addresses. And this is one of those pieces where, as I talked earlier about involving your students in this process, this is the first step to doing that. So if you haven't already done it, you can go in before October 1st and set up your FSA ID. So I would encourage you to sit down, parents, with your students, and go and create that FSA ID, each one of you separately. There are a few steps to doing it. It does require some verification and a code that you have to put in that they'll send to your email address. But I think this is a really good thing to sit down and do together. That way you both set up your FSA IDs. You've got them with separate emails. Yeah? Uh-huh. Great question. The question is, I have two students. Do I have to create two different accounts? No. Each of your students will need to create their own accounts, and then you will just need to create one account. You'll be able to use that same one for both your students. Okay, great. Good questions. Okay, so then what happens after you file the FAFSA? So the student will get what's called a SAR report, a summary student aid report, which basically lists out all the information that they provided on the FAFSA. And they can go and view that online with their FSA ID at fafsa.gov so that they can go and take a look and make sure everything there is correct. If something's wrong, then they could go log in and make a correction on the FAFSA. We as financial aid offices, then if you as a student list our school on the FAFSA, we will also get that information. So we will be able to pull in your FAFSA information and start processing as well. We at Fort Hays communicate with students primarily by email. So if an email address is put on the FAFSA, we use that email address to communicate with the student, and we will let them know that we have the FAFSA. We'll let them know if we need any additional documents. So this is an area that you'll want to talk with the financial aid office at the school you're interested in or that your student's interested in to see how they communicate. Because you want to make sure that you're following up if they need additional information or they need some clarification. So you want to make sure that you're checking whatever means of communication they're using in order to get the information to them. Their student records are protected by FERPA, which is the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, which those rights transfer to the student, usually at the time of college, which means that most schools will require that the student sign a release in order for the school to provide information to the parents. So I would encourage you to talk with the financial aid office if you are interested in talking with them about your student's file to see what process they use to collect that release. We would strongly encourage you to help your student, with asking questions or kind of navigating that process. We love to get questions from students as they are going through the process, but we are happy to talk with parents as well. But please encourage them to kind of take the ownership of that and spearhead that process. And again, talk with the schools about what their process is in order to be able to provide information to you as the parent on your student's file. Watch for award notifications. Depending on how the school communicates with the student, those may be sent out, a notification may be sent by email that requires them to log into a portal to view their financial aid awards and then give them an option to accept or decline those awards. There are some schools maybe that do those in paper, so you may have to return a paper back. So finding out what process they use so that you make sure that you're staying on top of that and returning those award letters with what your student wants to accept or decline. I think that this is a transition year for a lot of schools in kind of determining how they will work with early FAFSA and how their timelines might change in their office. It's possible that schools will be able to award financial aid a little bit earlier. That will vary by school. So if you have questions about that, I'd encourage you to talk with the individual schools about when that will happen. My guess is that for many schools, it may be late January or into February when they start making those awards and notifying students. But certainly contact those schools to get a better idea of what their timeline's going to be. So occasionally there are special circumstances that we may want to take a look at on a student's specific file. Because sometimes when students submit information on the FAFSA, the information is a little bit dated, and now with early FAFSA, it will be a little bit more dated because you're putting in information from 2015 for the tax and income information. And we understand that sometimes there may be some pretty major changes in a student or family's financial situation since that time. So we do have a process that's called a professional judgment review, where we can look at those files on a case-by-case basis. So for instance, if maybe unfortunately a parent lost their job and the information that they provided from 2015 had their old job and their old income, but now either they don't have that income or maybe that income has been dramatically reduced, they can provide some information to financial aid offices for them to review that and see if an adjustment can be made to make sure that their financial aid more accurately reflects their family's financial picture. If any of those things apply, again, Robin and I would be happy to talk a little bit tonight. Some of that you may not know until we're farther down the road. So I would encourage you to talk with your financial aid offices about what their process might be and if they'll be able to look at the file kind of on an individual basis to determine what their financial need really is. They may require additional documents as well as an explanation of what it is, and they can guide you through that process. So one thing we always like to make sure that students and parents are aware of is what's called satisfactory academic progress. And I won't go into a great deal other than to say a student must be making satisfactory academic progress in order to continue to receive financial aid. So there are three kind of different categories that we look at that are listed there: time frame, grade point average, and pace. And we review those after each semester. And if they're not meeting those criteria, they may go on a warning semester, or their financial aid may be suspended. And schools, all schools have a process by which students can appeal if their financial aid is suspended. But we have, our policy, for instance, is on our website, and you'll see that for most schools. But we do have to track that and make sure that students are making satisfactory academic progress towards their degree completion in order to continue to receive financial aid. And this is something, obviously, we can answer more questions about. Usually these questions don't arise until sometime middle of this fall semester, when students are getting midterms and those sorts of things. So we can certainly talk more about it later, but we can also guide students through that process if, unfortunately, they are suspended for financial aid purposes. We can take them through that appeal process and how to go through that. So how do scholarships work? I know that scholarships are always a big question that we get from students and parents, particularly at this point in the process. How do I get it? What's the best way to go about it? Scholarships, I think, as most people know, is gift aid, and is the best kind of aid to get. And some things that to take a look at when looking at scholarship opportunities are whether they have restrictions set on them, if they can only be applied to tuition and fees and room and board, or are there enrollment restrictions? Does a student have to be enrolled as a full-time student in order to be eligible for the scholarship? And then the other piece is to take a look at where they may be coming from. And I'm going to go about a little bit more in detail on these, but exhaust all the options. So look at the schools that your student, you and your student are applying to, different organizations, employers, as we talked a little bit about earlier. For institutional scholarships, find out if there is an application process. There are a lot of schools that automatically consider students for scholarships with their application for admission. If that's the case, make sure that you know when that priority or that scholarship application is, when the deadline is, because you may have to apply for admission by a particular date to be considered for those automatic scholarships, automatic consideration scholarships. Schools may also have an application that has to be completed. A lot of schools have funds, like through their endowment or their foundation, that may have very specific criteria that require an application. So find out if that process exists at the school. They may do both things. They may automatically consider students maybe for ACT or SAT and GPA scores, and they may also have an application for some of these more specific funds that they have to award. So make sure that you're aware of all the options there. Mm-hmm. Yes, 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 yes. The question is, if you're getting those offers now, do you accept them? I would say yes. My advice to students and parents is always accept them. Some of them may give you a deadline even that you need to accept or decline them by. If that school is still potentially in the running, accept the scholarship. You can always decide to decline it later, but yes, accept them if the school is still in the running, definitely. Making sure that you know of what the deadlines are if there is a scholarship application. Sometimes they will have a priority deadline and then a final deadline, so making sure you're aware of what those are. The scholarships might be merit-based, or they might be need-based, or they might be a combination thereof. So being aware of what the criteria that they're looking at to determine eligibility. It may require follow-up, so make sure that you understand what the application process is, and also then make sure you're aware of whether it's renewable or not. This comes into play, I think, a lot as students are comparing costs at different schools. So I would encourage students to, take a sheet of paper and list out, here's the cost, here are all the costs that are associated with this school. And here's, the scholarships that I have and the financial aid package that I have at this school. And how do those compare? And do that for each school that a student is looking at, so that you're making even comparisons across the board. And sometimes this can get tricky. I mean, frankly, you need to sometimes do some digging to get the accurate information that you need. So for instance, if you need to know what the cost is per credit hour to determine tuition and fees, so that you are comparing 15 hours to 15 hours. So be really, I think, careful when you're looking at either estimated costs or whatever, to make sure that you understand how many hours is that talking about, because schools do a lot of different things in publications to, kind of highlight what their estimated cost of attendance. They try to make it, as general as possible for the masses, but make sure that you're comparing apples to apples when you make those comparisons. So looking at scholarships, and I would strongly advocate comparing more than the freshman year, because your total package can be dramatically different. You may have a lot of aid or scholarships up front at one school, but you may have at another school that they're spread out over 4 years, and that may end up giving you the better overall package. So make sure that you're aware of scholarship opportunities, whether they're renewable or they're one-time. Make sure that you know what the renewable criteria is, because that can, usually it's based on a GPA, may also be based on a number of credit hours completed. So make sure that you're aware of what those requirements are. And I would kind of take a 4-year plan. Here's my projected cost for 4 years. Here's my projected aid, financial aid, scholarships, grants, and otherwise, to really do a fair comparison from school to school. There we go. So the Board of Regents, as I indicated earlier, does have some scholarship opportunities for students. And I know there's no way you can read that page there, but the website there is kansasregents.org. And if you search for students and student financial aid, you should be able to pull up some of their scholarship opportunities. There are a number of them, and I have many of them listed here. Anywhere from the Kansas State Scholarship to a Kansas Nursing Service Scholarship. There are many different options, and on the website you can look at the criteria for each of them and see if you may be eligible and you're interested in applying. For most all of these programs, you do have to submit the FAFSA, so you'll want to make sure to do that in order to qualify. And there's also an application for these, so go to the website and their application information and materials are listed there. So where do you go from here? The nice thing is we're doing this early enough that you've got time to be going through this process and having your financial aid finished and complete early on, relatively early in the fall semester. But make sure that you're getting all the information that you need to go through the process on a good timeline. So I like organization a lot. So I like things like timelines and month by month, I'm going to do X, Y, Z. So students, I would encourage you to do that. Parents, I would encourage you to sit down with your students and do that and make some checklists of things that you want to make sure that you're hitting, adding in the deadlines for the different schools that you're looking at, whether it's admission deadlines or financial aid priority deadlines, scholarship deadlines, so that you're making sure to hit all of those well before they're due. And then do some research on the different types of aid. Scholarships is the one. I think that, there are lots of them out there. There are some really good scholarship search engines. We have a number listed on our website. But I would encourage you to take a look at all opportunities that are there. And one note on scholarship opportunities from community scholarships. I think a lot of times students see that there are lots of applications that are out there, and it may require an essay or that they have to fill out this additional form or whatnot. And sometimes they decide that maybe it's just not worth the effort. But let me tell you, it is worth the effort, because we've seen students come in with outside scholarships totaling thousands of dollars. And there might be several relatively small ones of $200 or $500, but those can add up really quickly, and they can make a huge difference in the student's overall package. So students, I'm telling you, take the time to find those opportunities and to submit applications for those opportunities, because they can make a really big difference. And as much as you can try to limit your student debt while you're in college, it will pay off for you tremendously once you graduate. And parents, I'm sure that you echo the same. As much as you can limit any other outside loans that you might have to consider, we strongly encourage that to take place. So look for all those opportunities wherever they might be. Take the time to submit the applications to be considered for those awards, even if it looks relatively small, because those can certainly add up.